the Gospel of Mark. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they had laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they were saying nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Alright, sometimes my English ain't so good. I don't know if any of you had that kind of problem. So when we come to the end of Mark's Gospel, actually this is somebody who sort of cleaned it up for Mark a little bit. In fact, depending on the Bible, you'll find several endings to Mark. How that last verse should read is, "For terror and amazement had seized them, and and fled from the tomb. For terror and embarrassment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone." And the Greek reads, "They were afraid for an instant." Now, classical Greek, just like English says, you can't end with a preposition or a conjunction, and you can't end without punctuation. But Mark's Gospel does in the oldest manuscripts. So it's no wonder that we find in later versions, in fact, if you have a couple different versions of the Bible at home, we find one of 4 different endings. There's what's commonly called the short ending. That came up within just 100 years. And then there's the longer ending and the longest ending. And then even some beyond that. And they're all trying to clean up. Maybe you wrote a paper that way, I certainly have. They're all trying to clean up Mark's Gospel. He ends with that "for." I don't think that's an accident. You see, Mark starts out his Gospel by saying, the good news of Jesus Christ. And he ends it by saying, they were afraid for, and then it comes to us end. How are we going to write that story? And I think that's intentional on Mark's part. That he doesn't have a clean ending. I think often we come to the holidays, and Christmas is when we have the baby, Easter is when we've got the grave and the resurrection, and that's the end of the story. We want a nice, clean little story. Mark doesn't write his Gospel for that. He writes his Gospel for believers like you and me. And he wants us to know. He wants us to know about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and all that that means. And he wants us to understand that the story doesn't end with Easter or with Jesus being raised from the grave, but as those witnesses go out, and maybe they go out into a world like you and me, to a world where we're sometimes perplexed, where we're sometimes afraid, and maybe even where sometimes we find it hard to believe in the Jesus that Mark writes his Gospel about. The Jesus who died and rose and comes back to be part of our life and part of our being. And one of the common themes throughout all the Gospels, not just in Mark, is that his followers and believers don't see and understand, and in miracle after miracle, and event after event, we're rowed, we're taught, we read, and we begin begin to understand it. Oh, that because when Jesus did this, then they understand. Mark doesn't tell us about the after-resurrection appearances that the other Gospels do. Mark ends with this note of fear and open-endedness and part of our story. And Jesus enters into our fears and he helps us to understand. One of the themes of Easter that I think comes through is sort of the whole surprise. And Mark helping us to understand that I don't know it all yet. I don't know the end of the story. And God hasn't finished the end of the story. But God is still working in that story. And Jesus still is at work. And he's to be found in our lives. And we have yet more to learn. I don't think Mark's gospel is an